was a cold, silent night, and the rain poured heavily over the empty streets. Emily, a part-time Uber driver and single mother of two, was nearing the end of her shift. The dim glow of streetlights reflected off the wet pavement as she drove through the quiet suburban area. Her phone chimed, signaling a new ride request. The address was not far, but in a part of town she'd rarely ventured into. She accepted the ride, and the GPS guided her through winding roads, deeper into a forgotten neighborhood where the houses seemed abandoned, and the air felt thick with something she couldn't quite explain. After a few minutes, she arrived at the pickup location, a large, decrepit mansion that stood on the outskirts of the town. The house was ancient, its windows dark, and vines crawled up its crumbling stone walls. Emily felt uneasy but shrugged it off as nerves. Her shift was almost over, and this would be her last ride for the night. She honked the horn softly, waiting for the passenger. Moments passed, and no one came out. She checked the app. Passenger, Mr. Graves. A chill ran down her spine. Something about the name felt off. Just as she was about to cancel the ride, the back door clicked open, and a tall man dressed in a dark, rain-soaked coat slid into the seat. He had an air of stillness about him, his face obscured by the shadows. "Take me to the old cemetery," he said, his voice deep and cold. Emily hesitated. The cemetery was miles away and isolated. No place to be in the middle of the night, especially with a stranger. But she needed the money, so she nodded and began driving, glancing at the rearview mirror now and then. The man sat unnervingly still, barely moving. His eyes seemed to be fixed on the road ahead, but she could never quite catch them in the mirror. The tension in the car was suffocating. She tried to make small talk. "Long night?" she asked, forcing a smile. The man didn't respond. She cleared her throat. "What takes you to the cemetery at this hour?" A beat of silence. Then, in a whisper barely audible, he replied, "A burial." Her heart skipped a beat. "At night?" she asked, her voice shaky. He leaned forward just enough for her to see his pale face in the mirror. His eyes were hollow, almost lifeless, as he said, "Not all burials are for the living." Emily's grip tightened on the steering wheel, and the air in the car felt colder. The road stretched on, winding through the trees, leading them farther from civilization. Soon, the entrance to the cemetery loomed ahead. The gates were rusted and broken, and the place looked as though it had been forgotten by time. She stopped the car just outside, her heart racing. "Here we are," she muttered, hoping to drop him off quickly, but the man didn't move. He sat in the back, staring out into the cemetery. Then, slowly, he turned to face her. "You're not leaving, are you?" Emily's blood ran cold. I have other rides to pick up," she stammered, reaching for the door handle, ready to flee, but the doors wouldn't unlock. "You were my last ride," he said, his voice now a low growl. Panic set in as Emily frantically pressed the unlock button, but nothing worked. The man leaned closer, and she could feel his icy breath on her neck. "I told you," he whispered, "not all burials are for the living." Suddenly, the back seat was empty. Emily spun around, her heart pounding, but the man had vanished. Confused and terrified, she fumbled for her phone to call for help, but the screen showed "Ride completed." The name on the screen was no longer Mr. Graves. It read, "Passenger, Emily." She looked up to see her own reflection in the rearview mirror, pale, hollow-eyed, as the car slowly began to drive itself through the cemetery gates. Claire had always been fascinated by old mirrors. She loved how they could capture history, reflect the past, and hold secrets within their glass. So, when she stumbled upon a large, antique mirror at an estate sale, she couldn't resist buying it. The ornate frame was tarnished silver, and the glass was slightly warped with age, giving it an eerie, dreamlike quality. The seller, an elderly woman with trembling hands, warned her. "This mirror has seen things, child. Don't place it where it faces your bed." Claire dismissed the warning with a polite smile. It was just an old mirror, after all. Superstitions had never scared her. When she got home, she placed the mirror directly across from her bed, admiring how it made her small apartment feel larger. She spent the rest of the evening settling in, making dinner, and catching up on some work. By the time she crawled into bed, the mirror was the last thing she saw before falling asleep. That night, she dreamt vividly. She was standing in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection, but something wasn't right. Her reflection moved slightly slower, her eyes a bit too wide, her smile strained and unnatural. It was as if the person staring back at her wasn't quite her. She woke up in a cold sweat, her heart racing. The mirror loomed across from her, reflecting the room in the pale moonlight. Claire shook off the unease, blaming the strange dream on her late-night snack. But the next night, it happened again. This time, her reflection didn't just move oddly. It smiled at her when she hadn't smiled, a slow, malicious grin spreading across its face. Claire jolted awake, the image seared into her mind. She glanced at the mirror, and for a split second, she thought she saw something move in the glass, but the room was still empty. She decided to cover the mirror the following night, draping a sheet over it before going to bed. It helped for a while. A few days later, Claire began noticing odd things. Out of the corner of her eye, she would see movement in the mirror, a shadow flitting across the glass, though no one else was in the room. One morning, as she was brushing her teeth, she caught a glimpse of her reflection behind her, but it wasn't copying her movements. Her reflection stood perfectly still, staring, its eyes darker than they should have been, watching her every move. Panicked, Claire turned away from the mirror and closed her eyes, counting to 10, willing the fear to subside. When she opened them, her reflection was normal again, mimicking her every action. But something felt wrong. The unease lingered, crawling under her skin. She couldn't ignore it anymore. That night, Claire decided to move the mirror to her closet, away from her bed. As she was dragging it across the floor, she swore she heard faint whispers coming from the glass, like voices trapped on the other side. Her hand slipped, and the mirror crashed to the floor with a deafening shatter. Claire gasped and stepped back, her heart pounding. She crouched to examine the broken pieces, but something stopped her cold. In the shards of glass, her reflection stared back, but it wasn't her. The eyes looking up at her were filled with malice, the face twisted in a sneer that didn't belong to her. Suddenly, the room felt colder. The air around her grew heavy, thick with a presence she couldn't see but could feel. Claire backed away, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The reflection in the broken mirror didn't move, but its eyes followed her, unblinking, as if waiting for something. She bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind her. In the silence that followed, she could still hear the faint, echoing whispers from the shattered glass. That night, she slept on the couch, too terrified to return to her bedroom. But sleep didn't bring her peace. In the middle of the night, she woke to the sound of glass scraping against the floor. Slowly, she sat up, her heart hammering in her chest. There, in the doorway, stood her reflection. But it wasn't her. Its eyes were black voids, its mouth stretched into a cruel, unnatural grin. It stepped forward, leaving a trail of shattered glass behind it as it slowly made its way toward her. The last thing Claire saw before everything went dark was her own twisted reflection, smiling down at her, its hand reaching out to pull her into the cold, endless void of the mirror. Thank you for listening to me. If you like the video, do not forget to like and subscribe. Goodbye.